2 weeks had passed. 14 days since the hit. Since the courtroom fell silent. Since the air changed. And still, Dana hadn't apologized. Not publicly. Not privately. Not even to herself. Instead, she showed up to work, late, distracted. Her hands trembled when she reached for her keys. Her partner had been reassigned. Her calls were now supervised. Her name, once spoken with fear and respect, now echoed with suspicion. She tried to ignore the stares, tried to pretend that nothing was shifting. But the world had moved without her, and she couldn't catch up. By now, national media had picked up the clip. One cable segment titled it, "When Justice Gets Slapped." Another, "From Badge to Backlash." But it wasn't just about the video anymore. It was about the list. The growing, painful, undeniable list. Of people, of cases, of complaints. Judge Reese had submitted a compiled report to the Attorney General's office. Over 20 names. Over a decade of ignored warnings. Cross-checked with evidence. Dates, videos, affidavits. It was damning. And it was real. The kind of truth that couldn't be spun or buried anymore. It didn't scream. It stood. Unshaken. The department issued a new statement. Officer Mercer has been placed on administrative leave pending internal investigation. No badge, no gun, no authority, just silence. Dana read the memo on her kitchen counter. Her hands were steady now, but her chest wasn't. Her body felt hollow, like something had been scooped out and left unfilled. For the first time in her life, she felt small, invisible, not because anyone made her feel that way, because the power she once wore like armor was gone, and all that was left was her, just her. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if that was enough. On the other side of the city, Judge Reese sat with one of the first victims to come forward. The young woman who had been 17. Her voice still shook when she talked. But she talked. She told her story, in full, no holding back. Her parents never filed charges. They thought no one would believe her. Thought the damage would be worse if they tried. And now, they sat beside her holding hands, silent, but proud. Because for the first time, someone listened. Someone believed. And more importantly, someone with power stood beside them. This wasn't just a takedown. It was a rising. A slow, powerful, undeniable rising.
People who had stayed quiet began to speak. Former officers. Clerks. Even a retired judge. They admitted what they had seen. What they had ignored. What they had justified in silence. One said, "I always thought she had a temper, but I didn't want to rock the boat. Now I realize. I was part of the silence." Another. "She didn't just act alone. We let her act like that." And Dana? She watched it all unfold. From her couch. From a distance. From a place she had never imagined herself. The outside. She tried to call a few people. No one answered. She thought about giving a statement. Her lawyer advised against it. She thought about defending herself. But the words wouldn't come. Because she still didn't know what to say. 3 weeks in. The formal inquiry began. It wasn't criminal, yet. But it was serious. She sat in a small gray room, across from 3 investigators. A notepad. A recorder. A single glass of water. They asked questions. About her record. Her use of force. Her courtroom behavior. She tried to answer clearly. Calmly. But her voice cracked. Not from guilt. From fear. The fear of finally being seen. Not as a cop. Not as a figure of power. But as a person. And people can't hide behind uniforms forever. Judge Reese didn't celebrate. He didn't smile when the inquiry began. Didn't post. Didn't gloat. Because for him, justice was never about revenge. It was about restoration. About dignity. About truth, spoken plainly. The kind that doesn't need to yell to be heard. And when the media asked for interviews again, he finally said yes. But only under one condition. He wouldn't talk about the slap. He would talk about the system that allowed it. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. Simple background. No dramatics. Just his voice. Steady. Warm. Unshaken. He said, "I didn't press charges that day because I wanted to see if truth could carry itself without my push. And it did. Not because I'm a judge. But because people were ready to listen. Ready to stop pretending this doesn't happen every day. Not always in courtrooms. But in hallways. On sidewalks. In classrooms. On porches. At job interviews. In board meetings. And yes, even in uniforms." The segment ended with a pause. No music. No applause. Just silence. And in that silence, people began to reflect. If this story is resonating with you, if it's forcing you to think, to feel, or to face something new, please like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be heard, and you help carry them further. It had been 32 days since the courtroom. 32 days since her hand moved without thought. Since her instinct became her undoing. Dana stood in front of the department's disciplinary board. Not in uniform. No badge. No gun. Just a plain black suit and a knot in her throat she couldn't untie. The room wasn't hostile. That's what made it worse. It was quiet. Professional. Cold. Each question stripped away the image she'd worn for years. Do you recall the moment before contact was made? What led you to believe force was necessary? Did you recognize the man you struck? Every answer chipped at her armor. Yes. No. I thought he was. She stopped. She didn't finish that sentence. Because what she thought he was, wasn't what he was. And that truth was too heavy to say out loud. They didn't argue with her. They didn't yell. They just took notes. Listened. And left her in the silence she'd created for herself. Outside the building, reporters gathered. They weren't shouting. Not anymore. The story had shifted. From outrage to aftermath. From reaction to reckoning. Dana didn't speak. She lowered her head and walked to her car. But in her mind, a voice echoed. Not theirs. His. Judge Reese's words, not from the courtroom, but from the interview. She'd watched it. Alone. Late at night. And it broke something in her. Not because he was angry. Because he wasn't. He was steady. Measured. Wounded, yes. But dignified. And the contrast between his calm, and her violence, was unbearable. She hadn't slept well in weeks. Couldn't eat. She kept thinking back, not just to that slap, but to moments before that. Years before. Moments she'd forgotten, or ignored. The kid in the hoodie who cried when she cuffed him. The old man who begged her not to drag him in front of his grandchildren. The mother who screamed not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. She had never listened. Never paused. Never seen them as people. Only problems. Threats. Objects to be controlled. And now, she was finally seeing. And it hurt. Because when the mirror finally shows you the truth, you don't just see your reflection. You see your legacy. Judge Reese didn't watch the news that week. He didn't need to. He knew how these things worked. There would be outrage. Then paperwork. Then headlines. And then silence again. Unless something changed. He had decided to take a leave from the bench. Not because he was tired. Because he wanted to build something different. A training initiative. For young officers. For courtroom staff. For public servants. A way to reteach what had been lost in the culture of power. Empathy. Awareness. Accountability. He didn't want apologies. He wanted prevention. Because the truth was, what happened to him wasn't unique. It was just visible. Most injustices didn't get recorded. Most people didn't wear robes. Most names didn't get shared. And that had to change. At the precinct, Dana's locker had been emptied. Her nameplate was gone. Her access badge disabled. No one told her she was fired. They didn't have to. The process was moving toward that. One more review. One more vote. And then, it would be done. Her career, 12 years in the making, collapsed not in one day. But in pieces. Because when silence breaks, it shatters everything it once protected. Her mother called that night. They hadn't spoken in weeks. Dana didn't want to answer. But she did. And when her mother asked, "Are you okay?" she broke. For the first time. The tears didn't come fast. They came slow. Quiet. The way grief does. Not for the job. But for the person she thought she was. The person she now realized, never truly existed. If this story is leaving a mark, if you feel what she felt, or you've seen stories like this go unnoticed, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. Let's keep this message alive. The letter arrived on a Thursday. No ceremony. No warning. No knock on the door. Just a plain white envelope, slipped under the crack. Dana saw it the moment she walked in from the grocery store. She froze. Keys still in her hand. One bag dangling from her wrist. She stared at it for almost 5 minutes, like it was alive. Then, slowly, she picked it up. Sat down. Opened it. Inside, a formal statement from the disciplinary board. It wasn't long. Only a few paragraphs. But every word cut clean. Effective immediately. Officer Dana Mercer is hereby terminated from the Mayfield Police Department. 12 years. Gone in 12 lines. No second chances. No, thank you for your service. No final meeting. Just the end. She sat for a long time after that. No tears. Just stillness. Like her body didn't know what to do now that it didn't belong anywhere. She had spent so long in uniform, she didn't know who she was without it. And now she had to figure that out, alone. The news broke the next morning. Local outlets covered it first. Then national ones. Headlines read: Officer terminated after striking black judge during court visit. Dana Mercer fired after public outcry, review confirms misconduct history. Judge Reese declines charges, focuses on reform. There was no press conference. No dramatic fallout. No viral rant. Just closure. For the public, at least. But for Dana, it was only the beginning of a different kind of sentence. That weekend, she walked through her neighborhood in plain clothes. No badge. No belt. No power. People recognized her now, but differently. Not with fear. Not with respect. Just curiosity. And judgment. Some whispered. Some looked away. Some looked through her. She had never felt more invisible, or more exposed. 2 blocks from her apartment, she passed a mural. A large painting of community faces, painted by local kids. Black, brown, white, old, young. All smiling. All looking outward. She stopped. Stared. Then looked down at her own reflection in the glass below it. And for the first time, she didn't look away. Because what she saw now, was someone she didn't want to be anymore. She didn't know how to fix it. But she knew she had to try. Across town, Judge Reese sat at a community event. It was small. Humble. Folding chairs in a park. No media. No microphones. Just people. Victims. Advocates. Parents. Young adults. All gathered around to talk, not about punishment, but about prevention. He didn't lead the circle. He just sat in it. Listened. Let them speak. A young black man, barely 20, stood up. He said he'd never had a positive encounter with an officer. Said he was tired of being followed in stores. Tired of the wait. Tired of pretending it didn't hurt. And then he asked, how do we even start changing this? No one answered right away. Then Judge Reese looked up and said quietly. One person at a time. And it starts with listening. Listening until it hurts. And then listening more. The circle was quiet. But in that silence, something moved. Something real. Because change doesn't always come with cheers. Sometimes, it comes in circles. That night, Dana sat at her kitchen table again. Same chair. Same table. But a different woman. She pulled out a notebook. Not her old reports. Not complaint files. Just blank pages. And she began to write. Not excuses. Not justifications. But memories. Stories. Moments she had pushed aside. The boy with the bruised wrist. The mother who screamed through the glass. The man who never raised his voice, but still ended up in a cell. She wrote until her hand cramped. Then she kept going. Because she couldn't erase what she had done. But maybe she could finally face it. If you're still here, thank you. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this don't just reveal the cracks in the system, they show us how healing begins. Your support helps keep these voices alive. Months passed. The news cycle had moved on. Another scandal. Another protest. Another broken piece of the system rising to the surface. But in one small city. In one quiet life. The ripple never stopped. Dana Mercer didn't return to law enforcement. No department would take her. No position would protect her. And deep down, she knew, she didn't belong behind a badge anymore. She worked briefly at a warehouse. Then a call center. No press. No interviews. She didn't want attention. She wanted distance, from who she had been. Some days, she tried to forget. Other days, she forced herself to remember. Because forgetting was what had gotten her here. She started volunteering on weekends. Not as a gesture. As a consequence. At first, she was met with cold stares. Whispers. You don't belong here. And they were right. But she stayed anyway. Not because she wanted to be forgiven. Because she wanted to finally understand. She listened. To kids who had lost trust in adults. To mothers who were afraid of sirens. To men who knew what it meant to be profiled, followed, doubted, just for breathing. And each story became a mirror. Each voice a reminder. Change doesn't come from denial. It comes from sitting in the truth, until it burns. Judge Reese never returned to the bench. He didn't need to. He had found a new calling. He began teaching, hosting small sessions in community centers, schools, churches. Not lectures. Dialogues. He spoke about power. About bias. About how dignity doesn't come from titles or robes, but from how we treat each other when no one's watching. He used Dana's story often. Not to shame her. But to reveal how close any of us can come to the edge, when we don't check ourselves. He always ended the talk the same way. It's not enough to call something unjust after it happens. We have to see it coming. And stop it, before the blow ever lands. One afternoon, 2 years after the slap, they crossed paths again. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was at a quiet library, where Judge Reese was giving a talk, and Dana was helping arrange chairs. Their eyes met. He paused. She stood still. Then, without words, she nodded. And he nodded back. Nothing more. But it was enough. Because sometimes, the loudest accountability comes after the noise has faded. Dana never fully rebuilt her life the way it was. But maybe, that was the point. She built something different. Something quieter. She taught self-defense at a women's shelter. Began writing anonymously about trauma, anger, race, and shame. And every day, she wrote one new sentence in her notebook. I cannot fix the past, but I can face it, over and over, until I never forget. That was her justice. Not erasure. But memory. Judge Reese retired from public work 5 years later. But his legacy remained. The policy changes. The community programs. The new rules for courtroom conduct and officer assignments. The ripple didn't stop with him. Because dignity, once defended, doesn't fade. It multiplies. This story didn't end in a courtroom. It didn't end in a protest. Or on the news. It ended in a quiet space between consequence and change. In the long pause between who we were, and who we choose to become. If this story moved you, challenged you, or stayed with you, please like, share, and subscribe. These aren't just stories. These are mirrors. And maybe, together, we can make sure they reflect something better. Thank you for watching and listening.